Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to this afternoon's event. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies in Queens, and this is a joint event between ourselves in the Institute of Irish Studies and the Mitchell Institute for Global Security in Queens. Then I've just got a few housekeeping points to make, and then I'll introduce today's speakers. So first of all, if you wouldn't mind keeping your microphones muted through the presentation, that will stop us getting any feedback. That'll be very helpful. We're also recording this meeting, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, just turn your camera off. That will remove that danger. It's great to have so many people with us this afternoon. This has turned out to be a very popular event. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. I should say, just the format of this afternoon's event, we're going to have a presentation by Jim Waller, followed by a response by Neil Jarman, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments after that. So let me introduce Jim Waller to begin with. Dr. James Waller is Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Chair of that department at Keene State College in New Hampshire in the States. He's the author of 5 books, most notably his widely acclaimed book, Becoming Evil, How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing, published by Oxford University Press, and Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide, also published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He's held numerous visiting professorships, most recently an honorary visiting research professorship in Queens at the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Justice and Security in 2017. In the policy-making area, he's been involved in his role as Director of Academic Programs with the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, as the curriculum developer and lead instructor for the Raphael Lemkin seminars on genocide prevention. In 2017, he was the inaugural recipient of the Engaged Scholarship Prize from the International Association of Genocide Scholars in recognition of his exemplary engagement in advancing genocide awareness and prevention. He's appeared widely in broadcast and print media, including with PBS, CNN, CBC, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Salon, National Geographic, and the New York Times. And it's a great privilege to have Jim back with us this afternoon to talk to us about his new book, which we have the great pleasure of launching today virtually over Teams, A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. So Jim, if he's there, I think has some slides, which he's going to put up, and he's going to talk for about 40 minutes, Jim?
Yes.
And then we're going to hear a response from Neil.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can people hear me okay? Just a thumbs up? Good, perfect. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. This is it's a bittersweet moment because I was so much looking forward to when this book was released, having a chance to come back to Belfast and see so many of you that I've enjoyed time with and spent time with, and you've taught me so much. So it's sad that we can't do that in person, but I'm hoping that day is going to come soon that I can be back there in person and renew some of the friendships that I began in 2017. I want to thank the Institute of Irish Studies and Peter Gray for co-hosting this event, and a special thank you to the Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice, and my good friends Hastings Donning and Neil Jarman, both of whom were wonderful hosts during my sabbatical there in 2017. But most importantly, I want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to attend. It looks like we have about 60 people in attendance, and it's been great for me to just look down the list of people and so many smiles come to my face because I remember the conversations, I remember the warmth and the hospitality and the remarkable offers of tea and biscuit. I've never had so many tea and biscuits in my life as I had during my time there in sabbatical. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And hopefully, oops, sorry. Can people, Peter, can you see the slides?
Yeah, that's good, Jim.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. As Peter said, today is the very proud to have the book launch for A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. This book was released by Oxford University Press in the US last month. So I had several book launches here in the US, but it was just released in the UK, I believe, last week. What I want to do is give you some background to how the book came about, what I argue in the book, and then close before we have some time for comments from Neil and some questions and discussion from you as well. The background of this book was really a confluence of two things that happened in 2016. One of those is that in 2016, I had published my most recent book with Oxford entitled Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide. And I looked at preventing genocide from the viewpoint of before crisis happens, how do we prevent it once crisis breaks out? And then how do we rebuild societies once the crisis is over? And the book, it focuses primarily on genocide prevention, but the overlap between preventing genocide and preventing violent conflict or political violence, that's a pretty significant overlap. So a large part of the work I was doing was looking at what are the ways we understand how to prevent violent conflict from happening. What are the ways we can understand to help grow stability in a country so violent conflict is unlikely to happen? And one of the chapters in the book, chapter 4, a chapter I wrote on upstream prevention, I focused on risk factors. In other words, what are the things we look at that we have quantifiable evidence for, that we can look at a society and say, these are the red flags we look at. These are the risk factors that we know, if left unchecked, heighten the potential. They escalate the potential for political violence, violent conflict, or even genocidal conflict in a society. So I've worked in these type of risk assessments for a variety of countries around the world. Most recently, I completed one, for instance, for Burundi. But the other thing that had happened in 2016 when this book came out is Brexit. I was teaching a seminar for government policymakers in Europe, and we were meeting in Venice, Italy. And I still remember going to bed on the night of June 23rd, waking up on Friday, June 24th, and hearing the remarkable news that Brexit narrowly, but had passed. And I knew at that moment what the seismic impact of Brexit was going to be for Northern Ireland. I had been coming regularly to Northern Ireland since 2004, sometimes for my own research trips. Many times I was bringing groups of students from a college I was teaching at. We would bring about 20 students for the month of January on guided study program visits. So I'd long been in touch with Northern Ireland, but hadn't been there for a few years. But when Brexit happened, I knew immediately what my sabbatical project was going to be. And that was going to return to Northern Ireland because of what I anticipated to be some of the deep identity issues and constitutional issues that were going to come up as a result of Brexit. So the goal of the book for me and the goal of the research was to offer a comparative, evidence-based, nonpartisan analysis of risk and resilience in contemporary Northern Ireland. The book is not a history book. I'm not a historian by training. I'm not pretending to write a new uncharted territory history of the north of Ireland. I am by training a political psychologist. And the book for me was an attempt to look at Northern Ireland as it is today in terms of risk and resilience, and particularly how that might be impacted by Brexit. The research I did for the book, large part of it was done during my 2017 sabbatical, where I was an honorary visiting research professor at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's. I was very privileged that Senator George Mitchell, even while he was in hospital, agreed to write the foreword for A Troubled Sleep. His heart is still very much with Northern Ireland and the work of the Institute, so it was a privilege to have him write the foreword for the book. The heart of the book and the research is drawn from ethnographic field work with more than 110 hours of face-to-face interviews, primarily in Northern Ireland, but also in the Republic of Ireland, for more than 60 politicians, activists, former political prisoners, current paramilitary members, journalists, police, religious and community leaders. Whoever was willing to speak to me, I was willing to speak to. And really, it wasn't that I was interested in speaking to as much as I was interested in listening from. I wanted to hear from people about their perceptions of the current state of risk and resilience in Northern Ireland. So the book was written through three lenses: an existential lens, a conflict lens, and a comparative lens. And I think each of these make the book unique. The existential lens for me was an important one. I have a good friend in Northern Ireland who once said to me over dinner, "You seem very much at home in Northern Ireland." And in truth, I do. I feel very much at home in Northern Ireland. I have loved the people. I love the topography. I love the weather. The climate suits me perfectly in Northern Ireland. But there's a deeper existential connection as well. I'm a child of the American South, born and raised in Georgia at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. So I know innately what it's like to grow up in a divided society. In my case, a society divided by race between blacks and whites in the South. So my book is written, and my approach to this work was never anything meant to be judgmental or pejorative. I know I'm an outsider in Northern Ireland, and that gives me a different positionality than if I lived there and worked there. But there is an empathy. There's a connection there based on my connections of growing up in a country that is caught in the long-running grip of a culture war, a country fraught with contested memory, with dysfunctional governance, with social fragmentation. So really the existential lens for me in this book is a common shared predicament of I live in a country that's fraught with many of the same things that have paralyzed Northern Ireland, that have divided Northern Ireland, that have challenged Northern Ireland over the course of its history. And I think the second lens I looked through that was a conflict lens. People have asked me what is the biggest learning I've taken from my time in Northern Ireland and the conversations I've had with many of you. And I think a big part of that has been when I went into this work in 2017, I very often talked about post-conflict societies. And I thought about post-conflict societies as if post-conflict was a destination. It was a point that a society got to. And I knew there were periods of transitions, but I still thought there was a point at which a society could become post-conflict. I'm not really entirely sure that's the case any longer. I mean, many of you, when I spoke with you and I raised questions about the post-conflict status of Northern Ireland, more often than not, what I got was chuckles in response of, we're not post-conflict, we may be post-peace agreement, but the conflict has transformed. It may not be the armed conflict we've seen before, but it's still a conflict of politics. It's a conflict that's social. It's a conflict that has some cultural components to it. So the book was written from that conflict lens of recognizing that peace can't be simply reduced to an absence of violence. There is more to peace than that, and there is more to understanding conflict than that. And then the third lens I brought to the book was a comparative lens. I do a large part of my work in genocide studies, specifically with perpetrators, rank and file killers, people who've committed crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, people who've committed violent human rights abuses. So I've done that work now for close to 25 years. I've interviewed over 225 alleged and convicted perpetrators of these type of crimes around the world: Germany, Israel, the former Yugoslavia, Africa, African Great Lakes region, Latin America, Southeast Asia. And so all of those comparative experiences, I felt, gave me a unique lens to bring to this particular project. So it wasn't just the existential piece, it wasn't just thinking about it from a conflict lens, but it was this comparative lens that was a significant piece of what I wanted to bring to looking at Northern Ireland. So the outline of the book has three parts. One part is the theoretical background of what I work in as a political psychologist, which is social identity theory, and particularly the ways in which identity groups become perceived as threats to each other. I've worked some, obviously, on Northern Ireland's history, again, not as a new contribution or as a historian, but to understand how that history is packaged in contemporary Northern Ireland. How is it remembered? How is it taught? How is it processed? How is it understood? And how does that relate to risk and resilience? The heart of the book is looking at risk and resilience through three categories of risk factors, one related to memory and conflict history, a second one related to governance, and a third related to social fragmentation. And we'll look briefly at each of those three and some of the conclusions I've drawn in just a moment. And in the final part of the book is the section where I address the issues of what I see as the escalating risk of political instability and a possible return to political violence, and the fading resilience in the face of that risk. So the theoretical background that almost all of my work proceeds from is the notion of social identities or group identities, particularly in deeply divided societies. And these type of societies are many of the countries I work in around the world. I mean, honestly, very seldom for research do I go to a country that is not characterized as a deeply divided society. And in deeply divided societies, we most often see these binary divisions between groups of people based on religion, race, ethnicity, tribal identity, political status, whatever it is, these binary divisions that breed communities of fear and isolation. And in these communities, the type of incentives that we hope to see in a healthy society of trust, cooperation, dialogue, long-term social exposure to the other, however the other is defined, those things don't often happen in deeply divided societies. And I think even more tragically is that very often in these societies, whether it's Bosnia-Herzegovina, whether it's a Democratic Republic of the Congo, whether it's the United States, we see people in power weaponizing those binary identities and manipulating them to just exacerbate the social fragmentation, the social divisions, the social dismemberment, and in so doing, advance their own partisan interest. And I think what has always fascinated me as a case study about Northern Ireland, and really what brought me to it originally in the early 2000s, was a recognition that for all the people who want to say the two communities thesis doesn't apply any longer, it's too simplistic, it's not nuanced enough, and so on, that in my experience, the lived reality of people in Northern Ireland is a lived reality of two communities. But it's a multiplicity of how those two communities can be defined: Protestant or Catholic, British or Irish, Unionist, nationalist. They're just a multiplicity of the way those identities come into play. And to me, the fascinating question always raised by Northern Ireland is the question of, what does a nation need? And I know that Northern Ireland is not technically a state or a nation or a country, a lot of different ways it can be described, but what does a community of people who live together in proximity need to survive and thrive? Many people in political psychology say that those type of nations have to have a cohesive, exclusive sense of national identity. They have to have something that binds them together. They have to have a common life in order to be a nation. They have to have what Benedict Anderson has called some type of deep horizontal comradeship in order to have some type of imagined community. And I think in many ways, Northern Ireland is absent of a lot of this, not a cohesive, exclusive sense of national identity. So it really is a fascinating test of, can a nation, can a people survive and thrive without this type of imagined community, without this type of coherent narrative or sense of national identity? So what I've looked at in terms of risk factors, as I said, were the three things related to memory, to governance, to social fragmentation. In the book, each of these risk factors have their own chapter. And so I'll give you a brief sense of what those chapters argue here. As you know, cultures of memory are scattered throughout Northern Ireland. One of the things I love about working in Northern Ireland is that many places where you work on issues of memory and conflict history, things are pretty subtle. They're hard to find, they're hard to get at. It's not like that in Northern Ireland. Memory is present. It's a ubiquitous part of what life is in Northern Ireland. When I look at conflict history and memory, the types of things I'm looking at in terms of risk factors, and again, the chapter in the book addresses each one of these 5 risk factors point by point, is I'm looking at things like, in this country, what is the history of identity-related tensions? And perhaps more important than the tension is, what is the reality of threat between identities? So if you have 2 identities, racial, ethnic, tribal, religious, or whatever, to what degree does one identity pose a threat to the other identity? I think sometimes in this type, it's called intergroup threat theory. In this particular theory, some of the threats are symbolic. That I think part of the threat of the Irish language bill is that it's a symbolic threat to identity of people who consider themselves to be British. Sometimes the identity threat is realistic. It's the threat of jobs, that if these people gain jobs, my group loses jobs. But I think what concerns us in terms of predictive risk is when the threat becomes existential, that the threat of that people is a threat to the existence of my identity. Maybe not the physical life existence of who I am, but the existence of my identity. And much of what I look at as I continue to follow unionism's response, loyalism's response to current events in Northern Ireland, is that sense that unionism and loyalism feel that deep sense of existential threat, that a large part of what defines their identity is under threat and may in their lifetime may be erased in terms of their self-conception of Britishness. I also look at issues of previous genocides or politicides in a country, past cultural trauma. Are there legacies of vengeance or group grievances? And is there a record of serious violations of international human rights and laws? For each one of these risk factors, we have a bank of comparative quantitative evidence that says when these types of things are present, it increases the volatility and instability of a society and also escalates the potential for risk of political or mass violence. I think in Northern Ireland, and we could talk about each of those 5, but I've been particularly struck by issues related to past cultural trauma and how they find their ways into the individual lives of people in Northern Ireland. Many of you on this call are more familiar than I am with much of this data related to PTSD, suicide rates, prescription rates, alcohol abuse, antidepressants, drug abuse, increasing levels of domestic violence. All of this is easily accessible data within Northern Ireland. I think what is concerning as a risk factor is that these type of legacies of cultural trauma destroy the social capital that a country needs to survive, to thrive, to work efficiently, the type of relationships we can build so that our country works the best way it can possibly work. That's social capital. And social capital is destroyed when people are having to deal with the legacies of the type of trauma that you've experienced in a country where you've had 30 years of conflict in which there were no sidelines. Everyone was involved, at least from the standpoint of the possibility of being impacted by the conflict. I think often when I'm in Northern Ireland of a quote from James Baldwin, who's a well-known African-American author. And in 1953, Baldwin was visiting a Swiss village. And it was a Swiss village in which he was the only Black person. Everyone else was white. And he wrote about the village that people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. And I think of that quote often when I'm in Northern Ireland, that it seems as if people are trapped in history, and that history is trapped in the people, not just as a social psychological construct, but as something that has some devastating individual impacts from the standpoint of social capital. So as I was looking at issues of memory in Northern Ireland, certainly there's a shared past in the north of Ireland, but there's not a shared narrative of that past. There's not a shared memory of that past. There are multiple contested, conflicted, and competing memories. And as you all know better than I, each one of those are an electrified wire. And that, to me, that war of historical narratives has replaced a lot of the war of weapons that we've seen, but it makes it harder to continue to think about ways to pull out of the deep divisions when memory becomes used and weaponized and politicized in such a way to continue to drive wedges in those divisions. The second risk factor I look at has to do with governance. Governance, there are many things we look at related to regime type, state legitimacy deficit. To what degree do citizens in a country see their state as legitimate? I can give you an example from the US. A recent poll showed that 82% of people who voted for former President Trump do not believe that President Biden won the election legitimately. They think there is significant fraud. So 82% of Trump voters look at the current state in the US and believe the state is not legitimate. The person in power did not get there legitimately. Obviously, you're well aware of many of the questions, particularly coming from the nationalist community, about the legitimacy of the state of Northern Ireland, even the legitimacy of using the phrase Northern Ireland instead of the north of Ireland or the 6 counties. Weakness of state structures. I spent a lot of time with public health data in Northern Ireland, and the health system crisis and the social care system crisis and the waiting lists, the long waiting lists there are for healthcare. Those are state structure issues. Identity-based polar factionalism within governance, systematic state-led discrimination, when the government itself is engaging in systematic state-led discrimination. All of those are things that are concerning for us. It was fascinating for me because almost the entirety of the time I was researching and writing this book from 2017 to 2020, Stormont was closed. Northern Ireland set the dubious record of the longest peacetime period of any country, excuse me, without a sitting government over that 3-year period. So clearly, there are strong challenges related to issues of governance. One of the things I focus on in the book, in a comparative sense, are the limits of power sharing as a way to bring peace, as a way to try to end hostilities. Northern Ireland is certainly not unique in this. Several countries around the world have brought peace agreements from Yemen to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And as part of those peace agreements, power sharing between identity groups has been a significant part of it. And I certainly understand the intent behind this, the notion that if we can bring peace, we can't have a majoritarian democracy where one group sets above another group, that the groups have to share power. But power sharing, or this type of non-majoritarian democracy, was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a step in the road, part of the process toward eventually developing a healthy, fully functioned majoritarian democracy. But too often what we've seen is power sharing gets stuck. It gets institutionalized. And instead of breaking down the identities it was trying to reconcile, it entrenches them, it institutionalizes them, it reinforces them, it puts them in concrete. So, for instance, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's a tripartite presidency, 3 different presidents. One has to be Bosniak, one has to be Croat, one has to be Serb. Those things haven't broken down barriers between those identities. They've just reinforced the identities, and they've made gridlock in government just how governance is done in Bosnia-Herzegovina. More often, power sharing, I think, excludes non-dominant political groups. So again, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, if you're Jewish or Roma, and those are not insignificant communities in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Jewish and Roma, if you're one of those groups, you have no chance of ever being a president because your identity wasn't included in that power sharing agreement. So I've been very impressed by the work of Adrian Gwelke at Queen's University. And as Adrian has said, and I think this is an important reminder, that power sharing in this way, as I said, is just should be part of a process, not the end state. But it's also only one of a number of different ways in which stability, peace, good governance, fairness, and democracy can be promoted in a deeply divided society. But part of what I think has happened in Northern Ireland is the Good Friday Agreement. And again, it had a ton of noble intentions, and having spoken with Senator Mitchell about the work and the effort behind the agreement, and many of you were involved and are still involved in making that agreement hold. One of the things it did is, I think, the way it set up the governance structure in Northern Ireland is it took the deep divisions that were at the heart of the conflict, and it sewed those deep divisions into the very fabric of how Northern Ireland is governed. So rather than identity becoming expanded and reconciled, I think it's become entrenched and it's become reified. It's been put into concrete. And again, this is something that we see in comparative case after case after case around the world of countries that have tried to come out of conflict with these type of governance structures. And then the final risk factor I look at has to do with social fragmentation. And I take all the main titles of the chapters come from quotes from many of the interviews I did, but this one comes from a walk I took in Belfast along an interface wall with a former loyalist political prisoner. And as we walked the length of the wall, he simply said at some point, these walls entered into our souls. And what he was saying was the walls aren't just a physical barrier, a physical demarcation. They became a psychological barrier. They became a social barrier. And maybe they even became a spiritual barrier, that the walls have entered into our souls. When I look at social fragmentation in countries in terms of how it relates to risk and resilience, I'm looking at things like identity-based social divisions, demographic pressures. This doesn't apply as much in Northern Ireland, but sometimes in countries with significant social fragmentation, they're having large-scale refugee populations come into countries that tax the social resources, the human resources of a country. Unequal access to basic goods and services, I think, is an important risk factor. Gender inequalities. I spoke to many women who worked in politics in Northern Ireland, and even though certainly the optics of having a first minister and deputy first minister who were both female implied a strong sense of gender equality in Northern Ireland, there are many people who work in the political structures who still recognize the significant gender inequalities that exist there in power and access to power. And then finally, the political instability. As I said at the beginning, it was the political instability that I knew would be birthed by Brexit that really drew me back to Northern Ireland in an attempt to understand how this would unfold. As I finished the book in 2020, I was struck when I was working on social fragmentation. Part of what I was looking at was the parallel education systems in Northern Ireland. And the Belfast Telegraph had reprinted, and many of you saw this, from 50 years before, the results of a contest, the kind of Ulster I want. And one of the winning entries was from Jeffrey Nelson. And he says, I'd like to see all children, no matter what religion, going to the same school. This way they could grow up together and understand each other, understand that there's no difference between them. The children would become friends, and when they left school, would continue their friendship. I hope I don't have to wait too long to wait, he writes, for the Ulster I would like to see. And I think as much as we love the places where we're born and we live and where we work, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that 50 years on, Jeffrey Nelson, if he's still alive, is still waiting to see the kind of Ulster he would like to see, the kind of Ulster he would want. And so in this deep social fragmentation, what worries people like me who work in risk assessment is that in socially fragmented societies, there's a social separation that breeds or it allows room for suspicion, mistrust, stereotypes, fear, stigmas, misunderstandings, fear-mongering. They can just grow unchecked. This social separation creates echo chambers where the difficult conversations to restore social cohesion are left unspoken. The difficult assumptions are left unchallenged, and the herd mentalities are left unchecked. So when I looked at each of those three risk factors related to memory, related to governance, related to social fragmentation, while there are certainly things that were encouraging in terms of resilience and some great efforts made to move things forward, there did seem to me to be escalating risk in each of those three areas. So then what we worry about is if we have that risk, that structural risk, what are the things that can accelerate that risk? What are the things that can trigger that risk and turn risk into the reality of instability and political violence? And unfortunately, there are, I think, many things we see on the horizon in Northern Ireland that can both accelerate the risk and trigger the risk. There could be acute economic deterioration. I know the pandemic has hit the world. Economically, has been devastating. I know the impact it's had on Northern Ireland. That's the type of accelerant that we worry about when we look at global risk. There could be outbreaks of limited paramilitary violence that could accelerate the risk. A vote for United Ireland, both in the North and in the Republic, could certainly be an accelerant as well as a trigger. Brexit, questions of constitutional identity, a referendum on Scottish independence from the UK. I know that the Scottish independence movement did not quite get the electoral strength it hoped in the recent election, but still, if there's a referendum there and the UK starts to dissolve, it puts more pressure. It's another pressure point on Northern Ireland. The centenary year, this year, could be an accelerant. The release of census results is always something we worry about in post-conflict societies because so many issues of identity and resources are tied to census results and the expectation that for the first time in its history, the census will reveal a Catholic majority. And then the possibility of the shift of political power in the 2022 assembly elections. All of these things, unfortunately, just add increasing volatility to the mix as we try to think about the stability of the country moving forward. I've written about how these things have impacted Northern Ireland in terms of the April unrest and some of the violence that we saw. I've written about this in an op-ed in the Washington Post that you can find online, and an op-ed in a academic news outlet called The Conversation you can find online as well. But as you've seen and you've known the past couple of months, the polling data affirms this sense of increasing risk of violence and instability. In April, this Lucid Talk poll found that 76% of Northern Ireland respondents agreed that there's still the potential for violence in the future. In the Republic of Ireland, that figure was even higher. I believe the figure was 87% agreement in the Republic. The Cantor and Irish Independent poll from earlier this month, in response to the question of the prospect of United Ireland could jeopardize peace on the island of Ireland, 62% in the South agreed with that, 68% in the North. When you look at the North and you look just at responses from Unionist and Loyalist, that 68% figure rose to 90%. 9 out of 10 of Unionist and Loyalist respondents agreed that a united Ireland could jeopardize peace. So none of these data bode well in terms of giving us a picture of stability. And one of the things as researcher I loved about Northern Ireland is your country does polling. You do a lot of polling. And I know the polling is different based on whether it's online, in person, or on phone, but you're not shy on polling data. And this type of polling data, again, reaffirms the sense and the recognition that the risk that we're looking at seems to be escalating, seems to be accelerating, and particularly within the Unionist Loyalist community, that sense of existential threat. So what I concluded in the book is I didn't argue that contemporary Northern Ireland's a failed statelet or a failing statelet that can't perform basic functions because of widespread violence. There isn't that type of widespread violence now. The statelet still can perform most of its basic functions. It struggles with some because of governance issues, but it's not a failed state. It's not a failing state. It is, though, I think, and I would say this exact same thing about the US, we both live in states that are fragile and flailing, that in many ways are closer to a breakdown than a breakthrough. And I'll close with this. I had a chance in January 2017, 2 months before he passed, to meet with Martin McGuinness in Derry. And I know Mr. McGuinness is a complex figure, in some cases divisive figure for many people in Northern Ireland, but we had a very pleasant chat. That was a time of reflection for him, and I shared some of the work I was doing. And at the end of it, he stood up, and clearly in ill health, but was able to stand up and shake my hand. And final thing he said to me was simply, "I hope it wasn't all a waste." And that could have been some personal statement on his part, but I think was really a collective statement of all the seasons and all the years of violence and death and destruction. I hope it just wasn't all a waste, that I hope something could come out of the peace process that would bring greater stability. And I certainly have that same hope. I mean, a large part of the book focuses on risk, but there's absolutely space for resilience and hope. One of the things I say in the book is every story, and I absolutely believe this, every story has the possibility for a better ending. Every story has a possibility for a better ending. And I think that's absolutely true for Northern Ireland as well. We know, and many of you work, that we can promote a healthy memory environment. We can build stronger social capital by constructively dealing with the legacy of the past and not ignoring it. It's been fascinating to follow the Ballymurphy massacre news of the past week or so. And it's remarkable that finally, 50 years on, the people who were massacred at Ballymurphy have been declared officially and formally innocent. That's an important step of dealing with the legacy of the past. But what follows from it? Will there be an apology? Will there be justice? I mean, it's certainly poor form on the very day that these people are declared innocent, that the British government is floating plans for a legacy amnesty proposal that would also include British soldiers. So the past is certainly difficult to deal with. And again, I live in a country that we have not dealt well with the legacy of our past in terms of slavery and the extermination of indigenous people. But it has to be, we have to find our ways to promoting a healthy memory environment to try and strengthen the social capital we can bring. I think there's hope for a growth of political moderation, generosity, trust, courage, and respect. This is where I'm envious of Northern Ireland, is I live in a country that's effectively a two-party system. How we find political moderation in a two-party system is a challenge, and it's killing us right now. you at least have a multi-party system. There's the possibility of growth of political moderation, whether that's through the Alliance Party or SDLP, or whether it's through the two more extreme parties of Sinn Féin and DUP, remembering what it means to have generosity, trust, courage, and respect in governance. That can help move forward. And then finally, a commitment to maybe compromising the bounds of identity and how we think about ourselves, to recognizing a common superordinate identity that's built not on the things that divide us, but on the things that bring us together in terms of shared obligation, purpose, and opportunity. And all of this is a tremendous mountain of hard work. And I want to close with this, that again, to reference James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And it's going to be hard to change much of what needs to be changed to restore stability, particularly in a time of constitutional crisis that Brexit has put Northern Ireland in. But we know that nothing can be changed until we try to face it. And when I developed the dedication for this book, authors dedicate books to friends and family members and a wide variety of different things. For this one, the book really came for me out of a very deep appreciation for the people, for the cultures, the history, the land, and the place of Northern Ireland, and even deeper hope for the future of this region and the people who live in it. And I do believe that hope is there, even though it seems very far away at times, particularly in the midst of all the instability now. I do believe the hope is there. And that really is the spirit of where this book came from. And I drew a lot of that hope from the conversations I had with many of you who have shown up today. So I will finish there and turn it over to Neil, and thank you very much.
Jim, thank you so much for that wonderful insight into what is an extremely important and challenging new book. I'm sure there will be lots of questions and comments, but before we open it up, we're going to turn over to Neil Jarman for his views on the book. Neil is, I think, well known to most people on the call, long associated with the research of Mitchell Institute and currently honorary professor of practice in anthropology at Queen's. So Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Jim. Nice to see you again, even though it's a very mediated engagement. It's been a pleasure to. It's going to been a pleasure to be invited to speak as part of this. I've known Jim now for a number of years. When he first came to the Mitchell Institute to participate on a winter school I was running there, and was quite surprised to have someone of Jim's status on that school at the time. But I've noticed a number of other people on the call today who are also involved in that. So you've obviously built up a bit of respect with people around Northern Ireland over your time here, Jim. I would reiterate, it was a pleasure to be invited. It was a pleasure to read the book. I'd say that as someone who has, despite normally being an academic, largely stopped reading books on Northern Ireland over a number of years. I've read many in my time, but this is the first for a good while. And at risk of sounding like a publisher's promoter, I'd say, it's a good book. It's a challenging book. It's theoretically informed, but it's easy to read, which is a problem with a lot of academic books, getting a wider audience. And I think this book is easy to read. It's interesting to read. And there's two particular points I'd like to make about this, I think about it. One you touched on. That was being written by an outsider. But, it's an outsider, as you said through your talk, it's an outsider who's informed over a long period of time from being in Northern Ireland. It's an outsider who brings experience in other comparative contexts and situations. And I do think sometimes it's useful for an outsider to come in. They can ask naive, and awkward questions. They can challenge people in a way that an insider often works around the expectations and norms within that society. And then they can make some quite firm statements about what their opinions are. And I think your book, although you summed up some of the points at the end there, quite hard, quite depressing, quite pessimistic in many respects, although you try to give it a lift at the very end of some opportunities. But I think it's very realistic. And I think the other point I'd make about it was the value of it was that this is a book written 20 odd years into a peace process and looking at back and across a number of strands, a number of themes over a number of years of what's happened and what hasn't happened in relation to that peace process. And I suspect that there's a dearth of that in the literature, because a lot of the work on peace building, from my experience, tends to be focused on the early stages, the transition from the conflict through the negotiation process, and then the early stages of the implementation. And I remember talking to a lot of people about this, so that you tend to get interest dissipates after a period of time. That job is done, that issue is resolved. And you mentioned that somewhere in the book about the high percentage of peace processes that collapse a few years after they've been assumed to be relatively successful. So I think a book that looks back over a period of more than 20 years is a useful adjunct for the wider literature on this issue, in terms of opening up questions about what do peace processes entail and what do we expect of them and what challenges are we going to face. You raise some of those in relation to the type of consociational agreements, which for me get you over a certain hurdle. They get you away from the conflict and get people round the table, political table in the parliament, negotiating, politicking. But then they have other hurdles in front of them, which we haven't worked away, I don't think, anywhere yet, of getting over that embeddedness of the relative differences in those countries. So I think that's that overview, that challenging overview of where we are, and I think also within that, the where do we go from here? One of the points you made, I think, towards the end of the book, is you're saying that there's been, you took it to be a relative disengagement of the political parties with the peace building agenda. A sense from, I think, from the political parties that it's done. As you said, the violence has largely stopped. It's relatively stable, relatively peaceful. And I think the absence of any longer term roadmap for where we're going to go from here is indicative of the fact that there's a bit of a disconnect from the political party, both locally, and we've also seen that in relation to a disconnect from London, perhaps less so from Dublin. But I think in that void, some of the issues you raised about risk start to come more to the fore. And then the other point I would make that you picked up on, you touched on very briefly, was also in parallel with the disconnect from the political parties is the decline of civil society organisations, which were very prominent. I think for the first 5-10 years from '98, those two processes running in parallel. At times the political parties were leading, at times that process had collapsed. But the grassroots peace process, driven by civil society, including a wide diversity of political activists as well, kept the whole process going. And for me, the last decade or so, that whole process has dissipated. And part of that has been due to funding, part of it's due to lack of direction, lack of clear momentum in the process. And I think it feeds into a number of those risks that you highlighted. And I think just the last point that struck me was this: what do we call Northern Ireland? It might seem a relatively minor point, but you raised this issue about, talking to people about this is a post-conflict society conveys a certain sense of solidity, of permanent stability within it. And you used it in your talk a couple of times, but you're clearly, other people you spoke to are clearly not happy with the term post-conflict. You also talk about terms of failed state, you talk about terms of fragility. The one term I quite liked in the book that you came up with is as an adjunct to this, was you talk about anocracy. You talk about the contrast between autocratic societies and democratic societies, and those that are in between, anocracies, which is transitional one way or the other, but a degree of stability, but a degree of instability. I think I can put you to challenge to come up with a word like that comes from a peace building process, which is relatively stable, but is certainly not sustainable. And I think we've got a degree of stability in Northern Ireland, but I don't think we've got the necessary sustainability. And I think your book highlights it. I think it will be challenging for a lot of people when they read it. A lot of people here, and hopefully it will give some reaffirm the urgency of actually taking the issue of peace building seriously, rather than something we finished with 10 years ago. So I'm going to stop there and leave the floor open for some questions.
Neil, thank you very much for that. Jim, any points you want to come back on?
No, thank you, Neil. I appreciate that very much. And I think I'd love to hear some questions. I'll just say quickly, you know, it is when you do risk assessment, you have that possibility of coming across as overly pessimistic. And I say in the conclusion to the book, I may have overestimated risk and underestimated resilience. And I don't want to do that, because the truth is, the peace agreement, however fragile and tenuous it holds on, has held on. I mean, you've gone remarkably beyond the average life of peace agreements. But I think, Neil, you mentioned something that really does capture what I was trying to do, is the urgency issue of it's very easy to look away now because there's not widespread violence. And those of us outside Northern Ireland, it's easy to look away at other countries in the world that are in the middle of crisis. But I do think there's an urgency to asking very realistic, difficult questions about the status of the peace process, particularly in the context of Brexit and what that means for constitutional status and identity. So no, thank you for the thoughtful comments, Neil.
Okay, this wouldn't be a proper book launch if we didn't have a book deal available. So I've just put in the conversation bar the discount code for those of you who want to order the book directly from Oxford University Press. So do click on that link and follow through with that. But let's open it up to questions and comments. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, at the top of your screen you should see a little icon with a hand and a smiley face. If you click on that and click on the hand, that will just indicate that you want to ask a question. So please do that now, and then I'll invite you to unmute and to put your question directly to Jim. Anybody want to get us started?
You've got one question.
Sorry, I'm not seeing it. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Whoever's got their hand up. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jerry. Yeah.
Hi, John. How are you?
Good, Jerry. How are you doing?
Good. John, just a very quick one. You see in the other researches that you did, or in the other countries that you looked at, was there any impact of the like the emigration of people at fairly young age? So which I think is a feature of Northern Ireland society. I mean, so even if they do experience like a broader education or more inclusive education, but there's quite a lot of people leave. You know what I mean? And you're left with people. I mean, I have no idea what the statistics are like, but I know from personal experience that that's the case. Was there any other areas where that might have been, or is it a factor really in the instability or indeed the stability in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement? Because I think there's still quite a high level of emigration of young people for a variety of reasons. So they sort of, either for economic reasons or for other reasons, they don't live here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question, Jerry. I do think there are many post-conflict countries that struggle with brain drain, is often called. And again, I'll think of Bosnia and Herzegovina because there are just so few economic opportunities that many people perceive to exist in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that you have large populations of Bosniaks who have resettled, for instance, in Germany because they can get education there. They do have economic opportunities. And that type of outward immigration, I think, absolutely increases instability because you're losing young, talented people who could be part of rebuilding society. I think as I looked at Northern Ireland, Jerry, I tended to hear and both see in the data that type of brain drain was happening more often among unionists, youth who were going abroad to study university and most often not coming back. And it wasn't happening as often for nationalist youth. So it struck me that unionist communities were having to deal with a dynamic there that wasn't as much on the table in most of the nationalist communities.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good seeing you.
That's great. Thanks, Jerry. I could see Karen's hand up. Karen, is that an old hand, or do you want to ask a question? No. Anyone else? Michael.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounded. It sounds as if the book's worth a read. I've just a wee question about. I don't know. By the way, hello, James.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
It's a long time since we met.
Yeah.
Look, I don't want this to sound aggressive to you, but I was just wondering. You very casually referred to the extreme parties, being Sinn Féin and the DUP. That's a language was quite often used here by the media, etc. I was just wondering, would you give me, and I'm a member of Sinn Féin, and basically my day-to-day living is outreach to unionism and loyalism, and even within my own community. Could you give me an example of where the extremity is? Is it things which Sinn Féin do, or with they don't do, or I'm just wondering how an academic views from outside what the extremity is.
No, Michael, no, I appreciate the question, Michael. And I love our conversations because you always ask me good questions about my language and my use of words like perpetrators. And this is another great question. I meant extreme in terms of a constitutional status question that it seems
to me. What you said?
I'm sorry?
That's not what you said.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what I understood it to. When I said extreme, I didn't mean extremist in terms of violence or things like that, but just the constitutional status issue that to me, those are the two polar ends of the constitutional status question issue. And my understanding is that the rest of the political parties fall between those two in terms of those constitutional status issues. Does that help clarify, Michael?
No, I don't want to torture you on this, okay? But unionist parties want unification, want to maintain unity with Britain, which is understandable. An Irish Republican Party doesn't want that and wants unity of Ireland. So how come the Ulster Unionist Party, how come the Lens Party, how come they're not extremists?
No, I see what you're saying.
If you get what I'm pointing out, a man who's an academic writing a book about here appears to me to have fallen into the dominant narrative, which is if you're looking from an Irish Republican perspective, you're an extremist. That's all I'm saying to you.
Okay. No, I appreciate it, Michael. No, I appreciate you catching me on it, and I understand the point you're making.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We've got questions from Paul and Deirdre. So, Paul, you first. Still muted, Paul?
I think you're muted, Paul.
No, try again. We can't hear you, Paul.
Oh dear.
Sorry, Paul, we can't hear you. You might need to just go back and check your microphone is working. Let me go to Deirdre first, and then we'll come back to you, okay?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, Deirdre.
Thank you, Jim. I was thinking about the centenaries 2016 as well as the current 2021 centenary, and your comment at the beginning around those. And I wonder if you could expand on that in the sense of what role or risk does remembering and commemoration play or could play in building resilience?
Yeah, no, thank you, Deirdre. That's a good question. I think many times we look at commemoration as flashpoints because very often around commemorations, countries around the world, those points of commemoration can be points of remembrance related to division and violence and so on. But they certainly can also be understood as community building in the sense of this is how community identities are shaped, how they're understood, how they're taught. And in those type of things, when they are strengthening community identities, they certainly can help foster resilience. I think the difficult thing with commemorations is when they're not only strengthening this identity, but then they're denigrating another identity. That's when commemorations become particularly divisive. And as I mentioned, I work often in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and we'll see this with a lot of commemorative moments there, that many times commemoration is not just about who we are, but it's about who we're not and who we've beaten and who we've destroyed. And those are the things that they often can become flashpoints. But in many cases, if it can be more identity development focused, it certainly can be something that could prompt a point of resilience. Is that why you were asking? Do you have a sense of them working that way? Is that why you were asking?
Yes, I mean, that's part of my current study is around looking at how 2016 was commemorated here and what that tells us about memory and what that's meaning in the present. Yeah. And looking forward to 2016 or 2021 and then the legacy of the Troubles.
Right. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. Let's try going back to Paul, see if we can hear him. No, sorry, Paul, we still can't hear you. do you want to try typing into the text, into the conversation? I can read it out. No, okay, all right. Sorry about that. Okay, do we have other questions? Please put your hand up or shout out. Jim Upton?
Yes. The Good Friday Agreement offered to the Unionist side the possibility of Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom, and it offered to the Nationalist side a constitutional road to the possibility of the reunification of Ireland. If there's a slowing down in this process of reconciliation and peacemaking in most recent years, it suggests that where we're going to end up is with the status quo, that Northern Ireland is going to remain for the foreseeable future, and that could be a very long foreseeable future, as part of the United Kingdom. And if there is a move towards a reunification of Ireland through some kind of referendum, that would be seen as increasing instability, as threatening peace. I just wondered what your view of that was.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, Jim, I mentioned that as an accelerator or trigger is regardless of which way a vote or a referendum goes, there's nothing about it that brings a country closer to stability. And so the vote itself is going to be the thing that I think accelerates that sense of instability. And one of the things, as you know, again, I think the Good Friday Agreement has been a remarkable accord that has really held for an impressively long period of time. I think increasingly people are becoming concerned about the 50% plus one criteria for reunification, because that's a pretty narrow band of people voting for reunification. And I think in some ways, if people had a chance to redo the Good Friday Agreement, that 2/3 majority from just a political science standpoint is something that at least makes you believe that the decision, if it's a 2/3 majority or a supermajority, however it's defined, at least promises the possibility of more stability than 50% plus one. But I do think, and again, in the interviews I've done, the debate on when that reunification happened, some people would say 5 years, 10 years, in my lifetime, never my lifetime. But regardless of when that discussion comes up, certainly because it's raising that deep constitutional question, I think that is going to be another point of instability.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Do we have other questions? Liam?
Hello, Peter, Jim, Neil. Gosh, I'm even more pessimistic than I was a few weeks ago when I started a paper entitled Forebodings. And Jim's given so many reasons to suggest the problems are even greater than I was beginning to think about. Just a comment and then a question. The earlier comment by Michael on identifying the extremes, well, I must say I wouldn't have any difficulty in situating Sinn Féin at one end of the spectrum. After all, Provisional IRA were responsible for half the deaths in the Troubles, the Republican movement about 60%, and the lion's share of the maimings and explosions. The DUP is, I think one could argue, is at the other end, although it's not quite a straightforward comparison. But anyhow, we could talk further about that. But my question in a way is there a danger of sacralizing the Good Friday Agreement?
Thank you, Liam. That's a very direct question. I appreciate. I was waiting for you to say more, but no, Liam, it's good to meet you. I'm familiar with your work as well, so thank you for taking the time to attend. I do think, excuse me, there is a danger both in sacralizing the Good Friday Agreement and also in, I want to be careful how I phrase this, the people who were involved in the Good Friday Agreement and the work of the peace process since then have, rightly so, invested much of their ego in that. And so what I've noticed is if you question an aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, could it have been done differently? Could it, has it not worked here as well as we want to? For some people, then you're questioning their life work, and you're questioning how the ego they've invested in a very special document, a very special peace process. And I've never meant to do that, but what worries me about it is that maybe the people most involved in the peace process might be the most blind to some of the challenges to the peace process, because it's so important that it work well. It's so important that it be perceived to work well, that maybe they're less open to some of the critiques. And the comparative case I draw here would be the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. It is nowhere near the incredible achievement most people think it to be. And people in South Africa will say to you, it has challenges, it has limitations, doesn't deserve the celebrity status it's been given. But for some people, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was their life work, and it's what they're known for. And so they tend to be less likely to want to critique it. So I'd be afraid of any peace agreement starting to take on that sacred value to it that puts it beyond question or beyond critique.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Liam. We have a question from Jack Butler.
Hi, Jim. Jack
Hi,
Butler
Jack.
here from America as well. My perspective is I lived in Belfast, loved the experience of bringing my family there, and really kind of see the real power of foreign direct investment coming into the city. My company has an office in Center City, Belfast, and just see kind of week to week more and more companies coming in and placing a bet on Belfast and Northern Ireland. So I'm interested in kind of your perspective on how that affects your calculus when you're talking about your risk assessment and your prospects for the future, when you have at least kind of that positive momentum to lean on and maybe bring a whole nother dimension to the great things about what Northern Ireland has to offer.
No, Jack, I appreciate that question. I'm so glad you brought it up. That is a strong piece of the resilience puzzle, I think, in Northern Ireland, is the foreign investment, whether it is Game of Thrones, the tourism industry, the technology sector, all the things that have been drawn to Northern Ireland, that does offer hope for resilience, for sure. I think the question becomes, how broadly dispersed is that economic growth? In other words, I spend a lot of time in neighborhoods in Northern Ireland and housing estates with 85% unemployment in some cases. I'm thinking specifically of Mount Vernon. When that type of economic growth doesn't seem to trickle down to broad segments of societies, we worry about that as risk factors. So there are many very wealthy, for instance, African countries that still have strong instability because the wealth is contained in just the hands of a very few people. I don't perceive that's necessarily the case in Northern Ireland, and certainly not Belfast. So certainly the economic strength that is there for companies coming into Belfast that would have never done that in the 1970s, 1980s, that is going to offer a point of resilience. And in truth, for many people, they have been able to develop certainly a comfortable life, and that lowers some of the perceived risk of instability, to be sure. So thank you for raising that.
And I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if someone has one. Or if not, Deirdre, you want to ask another one?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
Jim, building on that last point, and the point that you made earlier about the experience of Protestant Unionist community in terms of loss of graduates, loss of students going to England and not coming back. And that's commonly talked about and seems to continue. And in the light of, the concerns around Brexit it seems to me that in terms of the violence on the streets that was beginning to emerge was just another argument for investing really, really heavily in the education of young men, not to ignore young women, but of young men from disadvantaged neighborhoods. And does that figure in the analysis that you've carried out, please?
Yes, it does, Deirdre. Thank you for raising the question. One of the things, again, when we're looking at societies that may be at risk, we're concerned about is called a male youth bulge, which just simply means large numbers of young boys, young men, unemployed, with very few prospects for employment. And so for some of them, the opportunity cost for violence is low. In other words, I'm an academic, I'm a comfortable job, comfortable life. For me to engage in violence, there's a high opportunity cost. It's going to cost me if I do that. If I'm a young man, I have no prospects, no future, there's nothing on my horizon that seems promising, the opportunity cost for violence is very low. And so we worry about countries that have these particularly young men with very few prospects for the future. So absolutely, as I said, and I'll use Mount Vernon as an example, although there's certainly Catholic and nationalist neighborhoods throughout Northern Ireland who struggle with similar levels of poverty and unemployment. But Mount Vernon, 85% unemployment. The opportunity cost for criminality, for violence, for political extremism in communities like that, as you said, particularly for young men, that's a pretty low opportunity cost. So if investment isn't made at that level, then you are just increasing the degree of risk which you're saying you're willing to live with because of that. So it's a good question.
Deirdre, thank you very much for your question. Thanks to everyone. Do we have another question from Jerry? Do you want to come back again, Jerry?
So just a very quick one there.
Yep.
There's been quite a range of investments in various areas in Northern Ireland since the 60s, and major scales of investments, and there's the Peace, Fresh Start, and all that stuff. So many attempts have been made to invest. Is there any model that has actually worked in your experience? Like that has actually targeted that group? Like the developments in further education here, there's a lot of conversation now about the post-COVID response. I've been focusing on the skills of that cohort as well. So there's been many attempts in Northern Ireland to channel money at that issue in various circumstances, but all the same, to try and build the skills of that age group, young men. Is there any of those activities in your other experiences that you think have actually worked?
Yeah, Jerry, I think one of the challenges of throwing money at problems like this is when the money is used inefficiently, or sometimes what we see in many countries around the world when the money is just used in a corrupt fashion and it doesn't reach the very people it's intended to reach as well. I would say, and this circles back to something Neil shared earlier about civil society, coming to Northern Ireland on a regular basis with students starting in 2004 and meeting groups in civil society who were doing good, important work and having them share that type of work with my students, I was struck at year after year after year how many of those groups disappeared. So every year coming back, half the itinerary would be different because half the groups had not been able to sustain the work they were doing, were not receiving the peace money they needed to receive, or for whatever reason, the groups had just fallen off the table. And I think that's one of the concerns is when you have some of the struggles with governance that we've talked about and a dysfunctional governance. And then when civil society doesn't have the money to run the programs it needs to run, or doesn't have the capacity to run those type of programs, I think all of those things are concerning as well.
Okay, thanks, Jerry, and thanks to everyone who's contributed through questions and comments this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. I think it's a tribute to just how important this book is, that it's got so much attention this afternoon. There've been so many great questions. Can I ask you all to thank Jim by perhaps just unmuting yourselves briefly and giving him a round of applause in the traditional way? And Neil as well, of course. Thank you very much, Neil, for your response. Yeah, let's give you a round of applause. Great. So thanks very much, everyone. Just a reminder before everyone goes. If you are interested in the memory landscape of this place, the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, we do have another forum in this slot at 4:30 next Monday. We'll be looking at the question of do we need a museum of the Troubles and Peace in our space? So if you'd like to join us next Monday at 4:30, just please sign up through our Eventbrite channel, and we'd love to have you with us next next week as well. So thank you again, Jim. It's been great.
Thank you, Peter.
For those of you who haven't already, please buy the book or order it for your libraries. As I say, the discount code is there on the chat, and if you haven't got it or can't access that, just email us, and we'll be very happy to send it out as well.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.